Hello, dear listener, and welcome to True Crime Sleep Stories. Tonight's story is a little different from the mysteries we usually explore here. There is no murderer to identify, no detective searching for a suspect, no cold case waiting for an answer. Instead, we're traveling back more than 2 centuries to the heart of London in the autumn of 1814 for one of the strangest and most tragic accidents in the city's history. It's a story that sounds almost absurd when you first hear it. A massive brewery vat ruptures, sending an enormous wave of beer through the streets of London. But behind the unusual circumstances is a very real tragedy. 8 people lost their lives, and an entire neighborhood was left dealing with the aftermath. So why tell this story on True Crime Sleep Stories? Because sometimes the most fascinating historical stories aren't crimes at all. They're mysteries, disasters, strange accidents, and forgotten moments that reveal something about the people and places that came before us. And the London beer flood certainly qualifies. Tonight, we'll step into a very different London. The year is 1814. The Napoleonic Wars are still being fought across Europe, and King George III sits upon the British throne, although his long reign is nearing its end. London is already one of the world's great cities. It is crowded with horses and carriages, market stalls and workshops, churches, theaters, public houses, and thousands upon thousands of homes. And in one busy neighborhood near Tottenham Court Road, an enormous brewery is quietly going about its ordinary business. Inside the brewery, vast wooden vats hold dark porter, a popular beer of the period. These containers are so large that they seem almost architectural themselves. Some can hold thousands of barrels. No one looking at them on an ordinary afternoon would imagine that one of them could become the source of a terrible disaster. And yet, on Monday, October 17th, 1814, something went wrong. At first, it was simply a problem inside a brewery. An iron hoop around one of the enormous wooden vats had slipped. There was no reason to believe that the neighborhood outside was in danger. People were carrying on with their ordinary lives. Workers were at their jobs. Families were at home. Neighbors were going about the quiet routines of a Monday afternoon. But then, suddenly, the great wooden vat ruptured. And in a matter of moments, an enormous quantity of beer poured into the streets of London. The story has sometimes been remembered as an odd historical curiosity, almost a strange footnote in the city's history. It is easy to imagine the absurdity of it, a flood of beer moving through the streets of London in the middle of the afternoon. But beneath the unusual circumstances was a very real tragedy. 8 people lost their lives, and the neighborhood of St. Giles was left to deal with damaged homes, shattered buildings, and the loss of ordinary people who had simply been going about their day. Tonight, we'll take our time with what happened. We'll look at the neighborhood where the disaster unfolded, the brewery at its center, and the people whose lives were changed that afternoon. We'll also separate the historical record from some of the colorful stories that grew around the event over time. Because like many strange stories from the past, the London beer flood has accumulated its share of legends. And sometimes, the truth is quieter than the legend, but it can also be more moving. So settle in, get comfortable, let the modern world grow quiet around you. And for the next little while, imagine the streets of London as they might have looked on a cool October afternoon more than 200 years ago. Imagine the sound of horses moving along the road, the voices of people passing between the buildings, the smell of coal smoke and brewing porter lingering in the air. And somewhere nearby, inside a large brick brewery, thousands of barrels of beer sitting quietly inside enormous wooden vats. No one looking at them would imagine what was about to happen. This is the strange, sad story of the London beer flood of 1814. But before we begin, we'll take a quick break to hear from our sponsors. Don't forget that ad-free episodes are always available to our Patreon members. Details are in the show notes. We'll be right back with tonight's uninterrupted story. Welcome back, dear listener. In 1814, London was a city of remarkable contrasts. There were elegant squares lined with fashionable townhouses where wealthy families lived behind polished doors and iron railings. And there were crowded neighborhoods only a short distance away where families lived in cramped rooms and underground cellars. One such place was St. Giles. The area around St. Giles was densely populated and had a reputation for poverty. Its narrow streets and crowded buildings were home to working people, immigrants, laborers, tradesmen, and families trying to make a living in one of Europe's busiest cities. The neighborhood was sometimes referred to as the St. Giles Rookery. The word rookery was used in London for particularly crowded and impoverished districts, often associated with poorly maintained housing and complicated networks of alleys and courts. Life there could be difficult. Many homes were small, some were partially underground. Buildings stood close together, leaving little room between them. There was no modern system of drainage or emergency services to handle a sudden disaster. And that detail would become terribly important. Nearby stood the Horseshoe Brewery, operated by Henry Mew and Company. The brewery was part of London's enormous and increasingly industrial brewing trade. Porter was particularly popular. Dark, strong, and inexpensive compared with some other beverages, porter had become a staple of London life. It was served in public houses across the city and was especially associated with working-class London. Brewing on such a large scale required enormous storage vessels, and 19th century breweries were proud of their vats. The bigger the vat, the more impressive the brewery could appear. At the Horseshoe Brewery, one enormous wooden fermentation vat towered above the surrounding buildings. It stood approximately 22 feet high and was surrounded by heavy iron hoops. Inside was a vast quantity of porter. The precise amount has been debated by historians, and modern accounts sometimes give different figures. The safest description is simply that the vat contained thousands of barrels of beer, with the total flood involving well over 300,000 gallons. To the people living nearby, the brewery was simply part of the neighborhood. Its walls and buildings were familiar. Its smells were familiar. The sounds of industry were familiar. London was filled with them. And on that October afternoon, there was nothing to suggest that the ordinary rhythm of the city was about to be interrupted. Among the people in St. Giles that day were families whose names would later appear in newspapers and official records. They were not famous people. They were ordinary Londoners, and that is one reason the story remains so affecting. 14-year-old Eleanor Cooper worked as a servant at the nearby Tavistock Arms public house. Mary Banfield lived in the neighborhood with her young daughter, Hannah. Elsewhere, another family was experiencing a very different kind of afternoon. A 2-year-old boy named John Saville had died the previous day. His family and friends had gathered for a traditional wake. In the 19th century, wakes were often held in the home, particularly among working-class families. Friends and relatives would gather around the deceased before burial. It was a time for mourning, conversation, prayer, and companionship. For those gathered in that cellar on October 17th, the day had begun with grief. Elsewhere, women and children were at home while many working men were away at their jobs. 4-year-old Hannah Banfield was with her mother, Mary. Nearby, Eleanor Cooper was working. There was nothing remarkable about any of these activities. Tea, work, mourning, conversation. The small routines of an ordinary London afternoon. And then, inside the brewery, something happened that would connect all of their lives forever. Sometime during the afternoon, a brewery employee named George Crick noticed something unusual. One of the large iron hoops surrounding the enormous wooden vat had slipped. The hoop was enormous itself. According to later accounts, it weighed hundreds of pounds, but this was not necessarily an unprecedented event. The brewery experienced problems with its iron hoops from time to time. Crick reportedly regarded the situation as something that could be dealt with later. A message was sent regarding the problem, and for a short while, the brewery continued operating. There was no sense that disaster was imminent. That may be one of the strangest aspects of the story. Nothing dramatic announced what was coming. There was no warning siren, no great mechanical failure that everyone immediately understood. Just a damaged iron hoop around an enormous wooden container filled with fermenting beer. Then, at around 5:30 in the afternoon, the situation changed. The great vat suddenly ruptured. The force was enormous. Wooden fragments and beer burst outward. The pressure damaged the brewery itself and caused a chain reaction involving other containers. Suddenly, vast quantities of porter were rushing from the brewery. The beer broke through the brewery's walls and moved into the surrounding streets. For people nearby, it must have been almost impossible to understand what they were seeing. Imagine standing in a narrow London street and suddenly hearing a tremendous crash. Then, imagine seeing a wall give way, and behind it, instead of fire or smoke, a dark mass of liquid moving rapidly toward you. The flood swept through the surrounding area. Modern retellings often describe it as a 15-foot wave. The exact dimensions of the moving beer are difficult to establish with certainty, but contemporary descriptions make clear that the quantity and force were immense. Buildings near the brewery were damaged. Some walls collapsed. Furniture and debris were carried along with the liquid. And because the streets and homes of St. Giles were not designed to handle anything remotely like this, the beer found its way into houses and cellars. On New Street, Mary Banfield and her young daughter Hannah were caught in the flood. They did not have time to escape. Mary would make it. Hannah would not. Elsewhere, the cellar where mourners had gathered for John Saville's wake was inundated. 5 people inside lost their lives. At the Tavistock Arms, Eleanor Cooper was caught beneath falling masonry. She was 14 years old. By the time the flood had subsided, 8 people were dead. They were women and children, people who had been at home or carrying out ordinary activities on an ordinary Monday. The tragedy was no longer simply a bizarre brewery accident. It was a disaster, and now the people of St. Giles had to begin the difficult work of finding those who might still be alive. In the immediate aftermath, the neighborhood was filled with confusion. People moved through the damaged streets. Neighbors searched through wreckage. The beer had mixed with broken timber, bricks, and other debris. And beneath it all, there might still be someone alive. Contemporary reports describe rescuers attempting to remain quiet so they could hear cries coming from beneath the wreckage. That detail is worth pausing over. The story is often remembered because of its unusual cause. But the people who experienced it did not experience it as a curiosity. They experienced it as a catastrophe unfolding around their homes. The brewery workers themselves were largely spared. Some were trapped by the flooding and debris, but survived. The people living immediately outside the brewery were not so fortunate. Newspapers soon carried accounts of the disaster. The language of the period could be dramatic, but the basic facts were clear. A giant vat had broken. The resulting flood had damaged homes, and 8 people had died. The deaths prompted an inquest. Only 2 days after the disaster, a jury examined what had happened. Witnesses gave evidence. The brewery was inspected. The circumstances surrounding the collapse were considered, and then came a conclusion that may seem surprising to modern ears. The disaster was judged to have been accidental and attributed to what was then described as an act of God. In other words, the brewery was not held legally responsible for the deaths. The victims' families did not receive the kind of compensation that we might expect from a modern industrial disaster. Instead, the brewery itself was able to obtain relief from the excise duties associated with the lost beer. The financial consequences for the brewery were therefore very different from the consequences experienced by the families in St. Giles. Over time, questions naturally arose about whether the disaster could have been prevented. Was the enormous vat adequately maintained? Should the damaged hoop have been treated more seriously? Could the brewery have recognized the danger before the vat failed? These questions are part of what makes the story more than an unusual anecdote. The beer flood sits at an interesting point in industrial history. Britain was changing rapidly. Factories and breweries were becoming larger. Machines and storage systems were growing in scale. But the systems for regulating industrial safety were nowhere near what we would recognize today. Large quantities of dangerous or heavy materials could be stored close to homes. Workers often had little protection, and when something went wrong, there might be no established framework for determining who was responsible. The London beer flood therefore belongs to a much larger history of industrial accidents. It simply happens to have one of the strangest causes imaginable. There is also another part of the story that deserves some caution. Later retellings have suggested that crowds rushed into the streets to drink the spilled beer. Some versions even claim that another person died from excessive drinking afterward. But historians have questioned these details. Beer historian Martine Cornell, among others, has noted that contemporary reports do not support the popular image of a drunken mob descending upon the flood. Instead, early accounts describe people attempting to rescue survivors and deal with the destruction. This is an important reminder of how historical stories change. The stranger the event, the easier it becomes for later generations to embellish it. A tragedy becomes a curiosity. A curiosity becomes a legend, and eventually the legend can become more familiar than the evidence. The actual story is already extraordinary enough. There is no need to add anything. On one October afternoon in 1814, a massive wooden vat failed. A wave of porter swept through a crowded London neighborhood. 8 people died, and a community was left to recover. The brewery itself survived. The company survived. And eventually, the streets returned to something resembling normal life. The Horseshoe Brewery remained in operation for many years. The site would eventually disappear beneath later development, and the original brewery buildings are long gone. But the event has remained part of London's history. There is something strangely memorable about the London beer flood. Perhaps it is because the cause seems so unlikely. We expect disasters to arrive through fire, storms, war, or earthquakes. We do not usually imagine one beginning with a wooden vat of porter, but history is full of such moments. The people of St. Giles did not wake that morning knowing they were about to become part of a story remembered for more than 200 years. They were simply living. A mother sitting with her child. A young girl working at a public house. Relatives gathering to mourn a little boy. Workers carrying out the tasks of a normal afternoon. Their lives were ordinary. And perhaps that is the quietest lesson in this strange event. History often remembers the disaster. But behind every historical disaster are individual lives that we're never expecting to be remembered at all. The London beer flood also reminds us how differently the past understood responsibility. Today, we might look at an industrial accident and immediately ask about maintenance, safety procedures, engineering standards, warnings, and accountability. In 1814, those ideas existed in a much less developed form. The language of the inquest reflected the world of its time. An accident could simply be an accident. A tragedy could be unfortunate rather than someone's responsibility. And the people who suffered most might have very little power to change that conclusion. Perhaps that is why the beer flood continues to interest historians. It is strange, certainly, but it is also a small window into everyday life in Georgian London. A world of wooden buildings, candlelit rooms, crowded streets, horse-drawn traffic, public houses, enormous breweries, and neighborhoods that could change forever in a matter of minutes. Tonight we can leave that old London street behind. The sounds of the brewery have faded. The damaged buildings are gone. The people who lived there have been gone for generations, but their names remain. Eleanor Cooper, Mary Mulvey, Thomas Murray, Hannah Bamfield, Sarah Bates, Anne Saville, Elizabeth Smith, Catherine Butler. 8 lives caught in a disaster no one could have imagined. Sleep well, dear listener, and until next time, may the quiet stories of the past keep you company through the night. True Crime Sleep Stories is hosted and created by Kelli Brink, produced with the support of our dedicated team. Subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform to help us keep telling these haunting tales. Visit patreon.com/Kelli Brink for exclusive content and to join our community. Thank you for listening, and we'll meet you in the shadows next time. Until then, stay safe out there and lock your doors. Good night.